All
presentation.
right. So, yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm Scott Wolfe. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice. And so I study policing and with a particular focus on what works in police training over the past couple years. And so that's what my colleague, Jeff Rojek, and I are going to be speaking with you about today. Our discussion is going to kind of focus on what we know and what we don't know from a research standpoint about what works in police training, and then we're going to discuss a promising avenue for police training that was the basis of a program that Jeff and I recently got done evaluating. And so, as we all know, in May of this year, George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer, kind of yet another example of excessive use of force by the police. And of course, this has led to a new sustained wave of public pressure to engage in police reform. Fortunate thing is that we're kind of a broken record when it comes to police reform efforts because we've been discussing these same issues for decades, dating back to numerous commissions, including the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, most recently in 2014. And so when we look at police reform, we know how to change the police, and typically those revolve around three areas: either the police hiring and selection stage, police policy and accountability, and police training. And so really what we have is this begs the question of, if we know how to engage in reform, why haven't we done so yet? The first answer to that question is really U.S. policing has improved and has gotten tremendously better over the decades, at the same time as we have a lot of work to do, especially when it comes to police training. And so that's what Jeff and I will focus on today. So when you hear conversations, especially within our own state of Michigan, about police training, one of the main things you hear about is implicit bias training. So we all have implicit biases, associations, beliefs, attitudes that are automatic mental processes that are uncontrollable, unintentional, but are believed to influence our behavior. When it comes to policing, there's mixed evidence regarding the extent to which police officers' implicit biases influence their actual behavior in laboratory settings. For example, in some lab studies, they'll suggest that implicit biases shape fictional officer behavior, shoot, don't shoot scenarios where they're pressing a shoot, don't shoot button on a keyboard. But at the same time, there's other studies that show the opposite. In some research suggests that officer behaviors are counter to what you would expect. And so what some refer to as counter bias, where they're actually under policing black suspects in those laboratory settings. But in recent years, we've seen many calls, again, especially in our own state, for implicit bias training for police officers. The real problem here is that to date, we only have one study that can speak to whether implicit bias training will change officer attitudes and behavior. And this study just came out within the past couple of weeks. And so a program called Fair and Impartial Policing was evaluated in the New York City Police Department. It was delivered to about 36,000 sworn officers. And here's what this study finds. First, they used a survey on the day of the one-day training program. So they gave officers the survey after their one-day training. And they showed in that survey that it increased officers' knowledge of implicit bias and showed greater concern for discrimination. But those effects were very small. The survey also showed that about 70% of officers that went through the training said that they gained a better understanding of implicit bias. About 2/3 reported learning new skills and strategies that they expected they could use on the street when interacting with the public. And then less than 50% reported that they would actually be likely to use these strategies during their enforcement activities, their policing activities. Furthermore, this evaluation conducted a follow-up study several months after the training had taken place. They followed up with these trained officers. 42% of those that were trained indicated that they had not used fair and impartial policing or implicit bias training in their duties in the last month. 31% actually said that they attempted to use it sometimes while in the street. And then 27% attempted to use it frequently during their policing activities. Now the question becomes, did it translate into changes in officer behavior? The report has a pretty clear conclusion when it comes to behavior. The authors of that report, the researchers, found insufficient evidence to conclude that racial and ethnic disparities in police enforcement actions were reduced as a result of that training. And so even if we start to accumulate more evaluations of implicit bias training, there's little reason to actually believe that it will help some of these things that we're trying to target in policing. A recent meta-analysis that synthesized nearly 500 implicit association studies found that implicit associations can sometimes be altered, but such changes are very small. And most importantly, those changes in implicit associations do not translate into changed behavior. And the reason for this is probably several fold, but two of the biggest reasons are that implicit associations, implicit biases are very difficult to change, and they're even more difficult to change and then impact behavior. And then on top of that, most training programs, including those that we see in policing, are too short. They're 1 and 2 day training programs that are not likely to produce repetition and change in skill sets. And so implicit bias training is likely a useful starting spot for having a conversation about race and bias in policing. But the reality is implicit bias training is likely insufficient to impact excessive force by the police. The second area of police training that we have some evidence regarding is crisis intervention or mental health training, CIT training. Here, there's some evidence that such training is beneficial. But again, the caution is, or the caveat is that these programs must be longer than 1 or 2 days for repetition and skill acquisition to really set in. Additionally, these CIT training programs, while useful, are too narrow. It is valuable, but it only focuses on skills that are going to be necessary for dealing with one segment of the population, right? So when it comes to CIT training, our conclusion, based on what we have thus far in the literature, is that it may help, but it won't be enough, especially if offered in isolation, to impact excessive use of force and racial disparities in policing. Third area of research that has really started to explode over the past couple of years is procedural justice training. Procedural justice involves ensuring officers allow citizens a voice when they're interacting with them, they're respectful during their interactions, they explain the reasons for their decisions. And this is important because research shows that when police officers use procedural justice, citizens are more likely to view the police as trustworthy and legitimate, they're more likely to cooperate and obey the law, and they're more likely to offer help to police officers. So with procedural justice training, we have a little bit more research evidence with respect to this area. Several studies have shown that procedural justice training can lead to some attitudinal and behavioral change among police officers. So we have one study was among Greater Manchester Police, and with surveys, they found that officers were more likely to support the use of procedural justice when interacting with the public. Officers were also more likely to use procedural justice during role-playing exercises that they had these trainees go through. And they actually conducted a citizen survey, and they found that citizens were more satisfied with police services if they had recently interacted with an officer that went through the procedural justice training. Second study is from Queensland. They found similar results. Officers more likely to support procedural justice, and they're more likely to use procedural justice with the public during their real interactions with people on the street as reported by their training officers, right? And then third, we have 2 different studies that come out of the Chicago Police Department where they train nearly 9,000 of their officers on procedural justice. Officers that completed the training were significantly more likely to support its use when they interact with the public. And then probably most importantly, one study found that procedural justice trained officers experienced a 10% reduction in complaints and a 6% reduction in the use of force across the entire agency. So those might look small, but when you're talking about impacting use of force and complaints, those are large effects. One caveat that I'll add is that these reductions in complaints and use of force happen at the same time right after Laquan McDonald was killed. And so what we don't know is whether this is a training effect or a depolicing on the part of the police in Chicago. And so our conclusion here is that procedural justice training in particular offers a lot of promise, but likely needs to be combined with other skill development. And then finally, and then I'll turn it over to Jeff, we have de-escalation training, another term that you hear thrown around a lot, especially in our own state. And what this involves is teaching officers how to calm down tense situations so they can avoid the encounter resulting in the use of force. Currently, there's limited evidence that de-escalation training is effective, but the good news is there's several studies that are in progress. But depending on what happens with those studies, even if they are effective, de-escalation training by itself is again too narrowly focused. It doesn't usually focus on training officers how to prevent interactions from getting tense to begin with. It also doesn't take into consideration the full dynamic nature and complexity of interactions with the public. And then really importantly, it tends to alienate. The term de-escalation alienates a lot of police officers, which may cause it to be doomed from the start because they won't buy in and they won't be receptive to it. And again, 1 and 2 day training programs are not long enough. And so the conclusion with this is de-escalation training may help, but won't be enough to impact excessive force by the police if we don't combine it with other types of training programs. Right, I'll turn it over to Jeff at this point. Jeff.
Thanks, Scott. So based on what Scott has led up to, it's kind of a precursor to a study we did. It's now started about 4 years ago, as we'll talk about, in Arizona and Tucson, Arizona, and Fayetteville, North Carolina. But it was funded by the Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice, the funding arm, research funding arm of Department of Justice. But the approach to our study was, framing the idea of police-citizen interactions in this kind of longer, really about 5-decade-old body of research on looking at the dynamic interactions between citizens and officers, and which comes from an even larger body of social interaction research. It essentially conceptualizes police-citizen encounters as a dynamic process which can unfold into an escalation of force or de-escalation from tense interactions away from force. And what you also recognize in his body of work, which is logical in its description, is police-citizen interactions have some degree of agency on both parties involved, in the sense that both share some engagement and how the situations can arise to escalation of force and de-escalation. But in our context, when we're thinking about police training, all we can do is focus on altering the police officer behavior. So a percentage of that interaction, if you will. And the question is, can we train police officers to be better trained to read and engage in interactions with citizens that reduces the likelihood of force while not increasing their vulnerability? And that becomes part of the dynamic here is, we want officers to be better decision makers, relate to some of the things that Jennifer brought up about ability to engage and have conversation, but officers are going to resist if it's not thought in mind of their safety as well. And so what we evaluated is a program called the T3 program, Tax, Tactics, and Strategic Organizational Polis Solutions. This program is actually a product of a $40 million DARPA-funded project called the Good Stranger Program. Those who aren't aware of DARPA, it's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agencies. And we very often think about Department of Defense in the context of technology, stealth, whatever it may be. The Department of Defense, it's through entities like DARPA and others, fund a tremendous amount of social behavioral science research. And what essentially they're looking at would be leadership, interaction. And in this case, what they're interested in is the idea at this time was funded in 2010, that you had officers at that point primarily focusing on military personnel, primarily deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, often dealing with interactions of folks who have different culture, different language, understanding, viewpoints, histories, bringing into the context that can create conflict. And so Department of Defense is thinking about how can we train soldiers to better handle these as it says, stranger interactions, to engage in some kind of dialogue that avoids at the best possible some kind of conflict, physical conflict at worst. And so that study incorporated a number of different pieces, obviously military, but also because it has some of that interaction framework, it included U.S. civilian law enforcement and a tremendous number of individuals from the academic community who looked at decision-making, communications, linguistics, a number of different areas. So that product was funded for about a 4-year period. At the conclusion, some of the partners involved in that thought about, because that was also context, how could this be applied in a policing framework where you have these police-citizen interactions that might involve some of the things we've already discussed, historical distrust, conflicting viewpoints of what should be done, differential perspectives, goals, etc. And so the program is oriented to that framework is how do we look at that social interaction dynamic and how do we train officers, and we don't think in absolutes like it's going to get rid of all, but how to reduce the percentage of cases that might escalate into some force or conflict. Scott, do you mind hitting the... So the T3 program has essentially three main components of it. One is these concepts of T3, which draws in again from these different bodies of research in the original DARPA program that was developed. And it focuses on issues about officers recognizing pattern detection, engagement, self-control, their behavior, empathy, trying to understand the goals and mindset of an individual engaged with, error repair. If some kind of interaction is not going the way that's in a positive way, how do we repair that interaction to get it back on positive track? De-escalation, decision-making. So that program would have 2 hours of training focusing on that issue. Then the program also had what are video-based training exercises developed to essentially increase the capacity of officers engaging in decision-making exercise of the concepts of T3 through an instructor-led or instructor-facilitated video exercise. And basically what it would do is it would break down as a decision exercise, looking at police-citizen interactions with various breakpoints, where officers are asked to assess the situation. What kind of dynamics do they have? What do you think the person, the other party is thinking of at this encounter? How would you act next? And how do these concepts of T3 apply or don't apply, and how is the officer exhibiting it as a training rule to look at whether officers successful or unsuccessful go through this. Then they also had a scenario-based interactive sessions geared towards the whole idea of rapport building, interactions, scenario-based interactions, in particular this issue of, they framed as goal, identity, and relations that are called GEAR. And that is, how does an officer with a stranger go into an interaction and try to quickly assess what are the goals of an individual when they're interacting with, whether it be vis-a-vis them or some larger situation officers are called to intervene. What are key elements of their identity that they can cue into, and then somehow in the last element, build a relationship with them to have some kind of rapport development as opposed to automatically a conflict. So this is the larger framework of trying to build some kind of skilled interactions of officers where they're better able to read an interaction, they're better able to build some kind of rapport and relationship with the individual and lead towards conversation de-escalation as opposed to potential conflict. The key to this also, which is underlying this program, and it was part of the original DARPA framework, they brought an individual who actually recently just passed away, a professor, he last was at Florida State University, named Anders Ericsson. Whether you know the name or not, you've all heard the concept. He's the one that keyed to kind of 10,000 hours makes an expert individual, although many have kind of taken that out of context as original research. But where that body of work and where he was involved in DARPA projects is the idea of deliberate practice that Scott was alluding to it earlier, where we give police officers a day or two of training and we think somehow they have some magical skill sets so they can just go out and apply this. And that's really not how we develop anybody in any type of job context. So the deliberate practice framework is this idea: you demonstrate the skill sets you want people to know, you give them opportunities to practice, including fail at those skill sets to develop them more effectively, and you provide them feedback to develop them effectively. With that concept, we're not doing a 1 or 2 day framework, we're doing training over a given period to allow the evolution of that skill set development. Scott, can you hit the next slide? So what we did is we looked at this program, and same as Scott was mentioning, for example, the fair and partial and other frameworks is, here's a model. It came out of a fairly well-researched and developed framework from the DARPA program, but does it work? Can it have the impact to reduce police-citizen interactions that result in force? And so we took a kind of experimental design approach, a randomized controlled trial, as I mentioned, the 2 agencies in Tucson, Arizona, and Fayetteville, North Carolina, where we essentially divided up officers in a simple way. Would be simply those who get training and those who do not. But we also give a little consideration to the dose of training, if you will. And that is, we divide officers into 3 groups: those who receive no training, those we consider a low dose of training. So over a 3-month period, they would get the training session, the concepts of this T3 program. They would go through 6 video sessions about every other week basis, and they had, 1 interactive scenario session. The second group, the high dose group, then did the same thing, basically at a doubled level for about 7 months. So basic concepts, 13 different video session exercises, and 2 different interactive scenario interactive sessions. And this becomes, and we'll talk about this at the conclusion, because there's a balance here you're trying to play. On one hand, you're trying to push this idea of deliberate practice. On the other hand, there's some real practical logistical concerns about how much training, given the size of police agencies and how much slack or downtime they have out of the field, how much training you can practically do. So that's the framework we went forward with. Scott, I think, do you pick up here now? Oh, excuse me. I just one last thing. So what we measured in this was 3 concepts. One is officer receptivity to training. So we surveyed officers, we interview officers, and this becomes a critical point, is if officers do not believe in the training or the trainers, the likelihood of they will be receptive and adopt the training is not high. And this is not unique to police officers. We can look in a variety of contexts. I can see very often in my own university context. If there's not viewed legitimacy to both the program, the concepts, and the trainers, then the program is going to have some struggles. The second one was we looked at changes in officer attitudes and perspectives through a survey mechanism about how they viewed priorities in citizen interactions, being one of the primary measures. And then the last one of looking at change in behavior through use of force reports, which is a tall challenge, because when you're looking at the idea of a planned change, you're looking at receptivity, you're looking at changes in attitudes, and at the highest level, you're looking at behavioral changes. And the challenge with this one is clear, is that use of force, despite very often the concepts, are actually pretty rare events in police citizen encounters. They're less than 1% of encounters. And so they become a very difficult measure at the same time. But so I'll let Scott take over and talk a little bit about the findings on it.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So here's what we found. With respect first to the officer surveys, we found that officers that completed the training, that were randomly assigned and completed the training, were more likely to prioritize procedural justice during citizen interactions. And so this is really important because it goes beyond simple de-escalation skills and leverages social interaction skills that we know, especially from other studies, that can improve community trust and legitimacy. And so when we combine that finding with the other studies that I mentioned early in the presentation, this really suggests that procedural justice can be trained, right? You can train officers on that skill, and it is probably best to have that be part of most social interaction-based training programs for police officers. Second, we found that trained officers were more likely to focus on staying self-controlled during their citizen interactions and encounters. And again, this is encouraging because it gets to the heart of many of the problems we see with excessive force situations. Cops like Chauvin in Minneapolis lost self-control and made a terrible decision and murdered somebody. This is partially due to the fact that most cops don't receive training on how to maintain composure and self-control during not only tense situations, but situations that are just everyday encounters, okay? We also found that dosage mattered. So police officers that completed 3 months of training were most likely to prioritize procedural justice and self-control during their interactions with the public, whereas officers that completed the full high dose, 6 months, were the only group where we saw place more of an emphasis on not physically controlling a person during their interactions. And so what we see is the longer dose had more of a de-escalation effect, right, where that came out. And so this tells us that longer trainings, especially longer than 1 and 2 days, are probably most beneficial, and that change in some of these issues related to problematic use of force may require a significant investment from a training duration commitment standpoint. And then from a behavioral standpoint, not surprising here, we have some mixed evidence. So within our 2 agencies, the first, Fayetteville, use of force to begin with was very rare in this agency, and we didn't see any change or differences between trained officers and those that didn't go through the training. This could be that the training didn't work in that agency, or it could be that there was a policy and reporting issue within Fayetteville. In particular, they only require their officers to fill out a use of force report if they take somebody to the ground or they go hands-on with a citizen and that person is injured. So anybody that's not injured doesn't get reported as a use of force. which is problematic and artificially deflates the numbers. In Tucson, however, we saw both the experimental and control group officers engage in significantly fewer uses of force. So this could be a statistical artifact, or it could be evidence of a diffusion of benefits. Even those officers that didn't go through the training may be reaping the benefits of being around their colleagues that actually completed the training. From a receptivity standpoint, we found obviously that receptivity matters. Officers who were more motivated to train were significantly more satisfied with the training and more likely to have attitudinal change as a result of going through that program. And so how do we motivate officers becomes the question. For one, police supervisors and command staff need to communicate the value of the training. They need to seek officers' opinions about their training and their experiences in those programs. And they need to assure the programs are administered in a fair manner. We found that officers that felt their agency and their supervisors didn't do these things were drastically less satisfied with the training and less likely to have attitudinal change as a result. And so this suggests really that agencies need to own their training programs as opposed to being forced into going through training programs that aren't part of their agency or they don't see the benefit in. Lastly, this type of training we'd like to point out is very flexible because it is scenario-based, or it can easily be put into a web-based video interactive kind of context. Officers are extremely receptive to going all web-based. And overall, what this helps with, as Jeff alluded to a few minutes ago, is that it's encouraging because this helps with the operational tempo, time, and money issues that have constantly been roadblocks and plagued effective police training in years past. All right, Jeff, back to you real quick to wrap up.
Yeah, I think the critical considerations, if you will, of these police-citizen interaction trainings, and I think Scott alluded to it, there's some pieces that exist with regard to de-escalation and procedural justice, and those are included in this program to some degree of the T3. But if we look at what we're asking to do here, and I think I alluded to it before, we're really trying to ask for more sophisticated decision makers among police officers, right? That are thinking more judiciously about what they recognize as cues as threats or violations, criminal violations, or whatever order violations, who better assess situations, who make better decisions in their interactions and what's a threat, how they handle a situation, control their behavior, reading people. And to do that, they need to be, the training to do this, has to have some validity in it. You don't want to just grab something because it's popular, but assuming you can find a valid program, it has to be repetitious, right? You're talking about core behavioral aspects of people. I recall being in one of these sessions, it was just good anecdote for this. One of the officers was talking about receptivity to training. This was more train-to-trainer sessions, where one of them saying, look, if you tell me I'm bad at firearms, there's a measurable test to tell me that, hey, I shoot better than you do, and I have to take, if you are better, then I have tips to gain. But if you tell me I'm bad at interactions with people, that's a very core aspect about someone's character and personality that people become resistant to, if it's just thrown in their face, if you will. So the idea of we have to be repetition to develop skill sets to merge over time instead of thinking we can just have somebody go through training. Logistical considerations are a big issue. I think, and we've worked with other projects with the Department of Justice where they want to put a lot of money in training law enforcement, and they feel like they could go in there and train half the officers in a 3-day session. And there's simply no possible way you can take half of an agency out of the field or out of their tasks and simply put them in training. So thinking about flexible formats, thinking about training delivered over duration of time, and through different components. It may have in-person, may have scenario, may have the web-based frameworks. And I think we're seeing improvements here. This organization we worked with in Polis has moved to very web-based frameworks that don't have to be as in-person, but give that same feedback. We've seen some augmented reality and other frameworks that might provide some various and delivery frameworks, but they have to be paid attention to. Logistical challenges could also be the funding for the training and facilities as well. Consider who provides the training. You must consider audience. if you're going to train officers on factors such as de-escalation or this type of stuff, and I would venture to say, as someone who's a university professor, and you put me and my university colleagues and tell police what's wrong with them, what they have to do, your receptivity is going to be horrible, because we don't have legitimacy in their eyes of experiencing their experience and what they've done. And so even if we're involved, it has to be in conjunction with folks that have some legitimacy in their eyes, who are supporting it, selling it through a framework that they understand that gives legitimacy to it. And the other consideration, and we would argue as well, is again, thinking about police citizen interactions as these dynamic endeavors. And all we can do is train officer skills. We can't train a citizen or whatever it may be, but how do we train an officer to become more skilled and adaptive? And in fact, a build on project that we now have funded Department of Justice now looks at these frameworks of how do we develop the skill sets through different web-based training, so for decision-making training, to what we consider adaptive decision makers, those folks who can read situations and consistently adjust to it. For example, being in a conflict situation, a pursuit or something, but when you end, you're able to adapt to it. Think about the considerations of persons you've just arrested, self-control, ability to slow down and calm a situation. These create these adaptive decision makers. So again, what we're trying to do through these programs like social interaction, adaptive decision-making, is build the skill set of officers and their ability to make decisions, read situations, and make decisions what are very dynamic interactions. The second main point we would argue is be evidence-based. There are a lot of programs out there for police training, and they sound good. Maybe they sound very popular, but your question should be, what's the evidence that it works? And I think that is particularly the case with the ties to our last point. There's going to be a tremendous amount that agencies, state government bodies are going to put out for this training. We don't want to see those dollars go to waste, those tax dollars go to waste, because we bought into a program that has no evidence of working. And so we would also argue, no matter what you do, is if you implement a program that's going to, whether it be funded state level or locally, have some independent validation of it, have some independent evaluation to see if it's actually working, instead of continuing to feed money into something that's not really having the impact that you want. So that said, that's kind of we could probably talk for a long period of time. I think all three of us could in our topics, but I'll leave it open for questions or Q&A at that point.
Well, I want to thank Jeff and Scott and Jennifer for very engaging and informative presentations. I know we've been a bit long, but these are important topics to be discussing now, and it's important to have good information for those that are going to be implementing programs and for policymakers as well. So I do appreciate very much the work that they're doing. We do have a couple of questions. I'll just open it up to any three. The first one is, do we have any examples of state or municipal policies that create a means for civilians to file complaints about incidents with the police that actually leads to accountability? I know that there are, I have heard of police accountability boards at the local level, but just wondering if any of you know whether those actually work, or if there are other mechanisms in place.
I mean, I would say
Vic's back.
Yeah. You know, I don't really know of civilian review boards that actually have been found to work. I think a lot of them are really symbolic in nature, you know, because there's little weight in holding officers accountable. I personally, you know, Jeff and Scott may have a different point of view, but I'm not aware of other studies that do a good job at this, unless, you know, and I think part of the problem is the fact that civilian review boards are actually, they don't, the recommendations that are made are advisory. They don't really have any real power, and symbolic in nature. You know, you can have people feel like, okay, we're doing something, but there really doesn't seem to be any real teeth in it.
Okay. And what about somebody asked?
Jeff wants to say something.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I would just say, like I said, they're mixed. There's if you categorize them, there's a lot of varieties. People will largely group in about 4 different forms of them. They're mixed, as Jennifer suggests, on power. There's arguments for and against of whether folks in civilian review boards actually have effective knowledge of really what they're looking at times, and that could be a debate. funding for them as well. And, you know, what's a better model? Is it a mixed model of policing has some expertise, or ex-law enforcement with civilian-based interests? But the measurement aspect, so going back to this kind of evidence-based, the measurement-based aspects, so much of our judgments on the civilian rewards impact are really perceptual. There's not a lot of clear empirical evidence to say this works or does not work, or which one does or does not work. I mean, it's like so many gap areas in this body of work, and it is clear and convincing evidence is still lacking.
Who are the leaders on these particular issues at the local or state level? Are we seeing some, I mean, there's been a lot of efforts that I've read about for local municipalities or local police departments, even state policies to change as a result. Are we seeing any leaders out there in terms of individuals, states, or localities right now?
That's changed over time. I don't, you know, and I have been away from that probably for about, so I paid attention to that for a few years, but even that is very tenuous. I could tell you one of the folks who were considered kind of leading movements in the past were places like Seattle PD, which right now is having its own challenges and troubles vis-a-vis council members, citizens, support for and against, and so forth. So you could have someone that comes up with innovative programs, but extenuating circumstances beyond it are not really supporting it. So I think, and Scott, unless you have somebody in mind, I can't think of anybody who, you know, essentially is the clear-cut leader when it comes to citizen review board programs.
No, I mean, I would have agreed. I mean, there's some agencies down south that I'm thinking of. You know, the Richland County Sheriff has had a pretty good one for years. One thing I will add to what Jennifer and Jeff are saying is one of the hurdles to citizen review boards in particular is that it's not necessarily a lack of willingness on the part of an agency to have transparency and get their community involved. There are legal challenges too in some jurisdictions, especially labor laws and collective bargaining agreements, that sometimes are the impediment to what could otherwise be a good program from a community standpoint.
So that's a great point, Scott. Thanks for pointing that out. So in order to address the issue of efficacy of these review boards, there's a lot of other factors that go into the equation. So I appreciate that. I had a question about the CJ curriculum at MSU. Does it include any required coursework in implicit bias or any of these types of issues you're talking about? How are we teaching our students about this stuff? I see Jeff shaking his head no.
Yeah, no required. Our CJ curriculum doesn't have required implicit bias training. I know I talk about it in my policing class. I know others do, but from a standpoint of an actual program, no. And I will say, and this echoes some of the stuff that I alluded to when I talked about in earlier the presentation, there's not a lot of evidence out there that those training programs will be effective.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so that would be the biggest impediment right now to moving forward with that, is whether it's a good use of our time and resources.
Yeah, I know that the MCOLS, Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards, has dove deep into these kinds of training issues, and it'd be interesting maybe to have a sit down with them and learn more about how they're doing, what they're doing, because your information is pretty important. Well, we do have some news from Louisville. The grand jury did charge one of 3 officers in the fatal shooting. I see an article here, but that seems to be the headline right now. So that is breaking news. So we will see how that moves forward. Again, I want to thank Jennifer, Scott, and Jeff for taking the time to present. I know how busy everyone is, especially as people with students trying to juggle online course learning and everything else that's going on these days. But again, you know, this is the second time we've had you on. And I'm going to try and find additional opportunities, because I think the work that you're doing is of the utmost importance as policymakers and local communities move forward. So if there are, if any of you have any closing remarks, now's the time.
Thanks, Arnold. We appreciate it.
All right.
Yep.
And to those who attended, thank you very much for taking time. As I've mentioned to several of you, we will have the presentations as well as the recorded session up on our website as soon as we can, and you will be notified as an attendee when that is available. Thanks again to everyone for their time today. And join us again on October 21st for our next IPPSR Public Policy Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.